Okay, let's get started. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today with Wild Farm Alliance's The Role of Birds on the Farm online course. And here at Wild Farm Alliance, our mission is to promote healthy, viable agriculture that helps to protect and restore wild nature. And this virtual course teaches folks about how to support beneficial birds and manage pest birds on farms. So you may have joined us for one of our previous 8 lessons. Welcome back. And if this is your first lesson, well, welcome in. I wanted to cover a few of the basics here with Zoom, even though everyone has probably been to a Zoom session or 2 or a million. But in general, everybody should be muted during the presentations that we're hearing today. There will be these polls that'll pop up on your screen. If you could please fill those out, that helps us not only understand who our audience is today, but also at the end allows us to report back to our project funders. So at the end, when you get asked some information about yes or no, those aren't graded and your responses won't be shared. If you're experiencing any technical issues, there are moderators in the chat that will help you out. So my name is Brian Fagundis, and I'm the programs coordinator for the Wild Farm Alliance. And in the chat room, we have Shelly, who is going to be helping out field any of these questions that get filled in. And so if you do have any questions for our presenters today, just pop those into the chat, and then I'll be sure to direct those to our presenters. So you're here today in order to learn about how to see the land through the eyes of birds. And then in a couple of weeks, we're going to wrap it all up with lesson 10 on prioritizing what birds prefer. And so today, here's the agenda that we're going to cover. So our first speaker is Wendell Gilgert, and he's Emeritus with both the NRCS as well as Point Blue. And then after that, we're going to have Dr. Ashley Kennedy, who's an environmental scientist for the state of Delaware. And then after each of their presentations, we're going to have an opportunity to field any questions that are unanswered during their talks, and maybe get into some details about some of your farms and how we can encourage birds on them. And then we're going to wrap it all up at the very end. And so with that, if Wendell, you want to get ready, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and it's on to you. So thanks everyone for joining.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. Going to go through kind of a rapid life of birds. We're going to talk a little bit about the different kinds of cover requirements, and then later we'll be talking a little bit about water and food resources that are critical for year-round habitat. When we look at this is an illustration from the California Partners in Flight riparian obligate birds. And here you'll see a number of different kinds of vegetation. You got canopy vegetation, you got mid-story vegetation, you got ground vegetation, and a representation of different kinds of birds that will use each of these different kinds of habitats in these riparian areas, just as an example of the diversity of vegetation necessary to meet life history requirements for a lot of different kinds of birds. So birds are not unlike human beings or other animals. They don't just have one kind of requirement. They've got perching, foraging, roosting, breeding, nesting, brood rearing, thermal, loafing, escape covers. And I like to think of it a little bit, it helps people visualize it a little bit like your own home. I mean, you've got sleeping cover, you've got loafing cover, you've got foraging cover, you've got all kinds of other covers that birds also need, except they don't have a neat little house with a roof over their head. They have to make do with what's in nature, and the better that the farm provides those elements, those roles for these birds, then the more healthy and the more robust and the more diverse the bird population is going to be. Okay, so here's an example of a series of buffers in the cropping systems along. So you got a riparian buffer, you got a field border buffer along with a crop of beans. So you get, this is kind of an ideal of what we'd really like to see out there, for wildlife, that it's not just all a monoculture of a single kind of crop. So we've got, of course, perching cover as exemplified by this young great horned owl. We've got foraging cover. In this case, we've got sandhill cranes that are sharing corn stubble with cattle. The point that I'd like to make here is that crop stubble is really incredibly important, that if you can help it, not to take your implement and immediately take your stubble and put it into the ground, but let it be utilized by animals, possibly even livestock. We know in the case of, pardon me, in the case of rice stubble, what you're seeing here with sandhill cranes and white front geese, and there's probably some other kinds of geese out there too, that they actually, in addition to using the rice and the insects that are in the field and some of the emerging vegetation, that they contribute dung into the field that is actually measurable. Here's an example of swings and socks foraging in an alfalfa field. Many of you have seen alfalfa after the crop has been taken off, the first irrigation. As the water advances across the field, you'll see a whole number of things like egrets, hawks, gulls, all kinds of other things picking up gophers, voles, other kinds of insects as the water moves across the field. There's lots of opportunities for these birds to take care of a number of pests that could be associated with those crops. Breeding habitat in this case is a lek. Lek's another word for breeding grounds for greater sage grouse. For those of you who are ranchers in the Great Basin, you may have leks on your property or know of leks. Really important areas. Some of them have been used for thousands of years. So these birds have high fidelity to these locations. So not disturbing them when it's lekking season in the spring. And that could be with all the different kinds of grouse are lekking birds across the country. Pair bonding is another kind of breeding habitat. In this case, there's a couple of shovelers here. And then we get into actually structure for nesting. In this case, we've got a white-breasted nuthatch on a blue oak nesting cavity. It had been carrying insects into its brood in the tree here. Here's some red-winged blackbird nest. You can see the different kinds of hiding. Pardon me, the different kinds of hiding that are necessary for these birds to be able to nest and camouflage and keep predators from destroying or eating the eggs or the young. There's some more great horned owls. In this case, it's in a canopy of oaks. One of the things I'd like to really underscore is, again, going back to the stubble, because this is some thermal cover utilized by some pheasants in snow country. I can see the females here on the right and the male here toward the center. If you can leave a little bit of your crop standing, not only for food, but also for cover, for escape cover, and for thermal cover, it will really greatly enhance the ability of these birds to make it through hard weather parts of the year, whether it's in the summer on days like today where I live, it's going to get 106 today. And so when we talk about thermal cover, we're not just talking about cold and wind, we're also talking about heat and dryness and drought. Here's some, in this case, resting cover, maybe thermal cover of an owl hanging out in some ferns. This is a case of a belted kingfisher trying to get away from the sharp-shinned hawk flying right over the top of the water. In this case, I'm not sure if there's a lot of escape cover nearby. He can probably dart off in vegetation and maybe avoid becoming dinner. I'm not sure what happened to them. The trees out there and the various variety of trees really do offer a lot of different kinds of cover for a lot of different kinds of birds. And as you spend time observing what's going on in your farm or your ranch, you'll see that these birds are using it. Maybe it's for loafing cover, maybe it's for nesting cover, maybe it's for roosting, maybe it's for foraging. Any number of these different kinds of life history requirements. These plants can provide some of those components. I want to underscore that there really is no single plant that will provide everything that a single species will need that I know of. Okay, some foraging. In this case, the field sparrows got the caterpillar in its mouth, and Ashley's going to be talking more in detail about this coming up. Again, birds foraging in bark. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but even in the wintertime, I don't worry about pests and hiring any kind of pest control, because the birds come up in the eaves and around the houses and pick up the spiders and pick up the insects that are hanging around the house. So even a structure like a barn or a house or an outbuilding can provide habitat. One of the things that we've learned over time is that everything's habitat. Quality varies. So you've seen killdeers in the middle of a gravel road. Who would think a gravel road is habitat? Well, a killdeer does, because that's a place where they can camouflage and hide their eggs. If you do find that on your farm or on your ranch, it's great to stake it so you can avoid hitting the nest until the brood is hatched, in which case the little guys are precocious. They're on their feet right away and will get off your gravel road and forthwith looking for bugs. Song sparrow, in this case, on the ground, eating ground being habitat, eating seeds. Flickers eating dogwood berries. I've got a dogwood in my place, and the berries don't last a month in the fall. Once the leaves fall off, they pretty much disappear. Flickers, mockingbirds, cedar waxwings, white crown, gold crown sparrows. So all kinds of birds will utilize the berries from the native species. Of course, the hummingbirds are one of those birds that seems like everybody likes to see. Planting and having multiple floristic resources to allow them to utilize nectar and pollen is something that we encourage ranchers to do, whether it's by way of cover crop or by way of hedgerows or other kinds of buffers where you can have floristic resources that these animals can use, particularly perennial shrubs and trees that flower. Of course, another thing is just birds like you and I, we do not live very long without water. And so making sure that there's water resources, whether it's open water, like this black phoebe drinking on the wing. You see swallows drinking, or aerial drinkers as well. Not only birds, but bats also are aerial drinkers. So that open water provides that resource for them to be able to take a drink on the fly. Maybe it's a leaking pipe. In this case, we like to see this kind of pipe because birds are not going to get into them. But just as an aside, pipes or open fence areas that have got the posts that are open are very dangerous for birds. We find that we lose a lot of birds going down into those, maybe seeking a cavity for nesting or whatever, and they don't make it back out. So covering pipes or at least having very small apertures so they can't get in can be really important on your farm or on your ranch. There's some more open water and irrigation. American robin taking advantage of not only just the water resource itself, but being able to bathe and keep its health intact. Here's a hummingbird. Actually, morning dew ends up being a really important component For those of us who live in the fog belt over here along the coast of California, we know that that morning frost or the dew from fog is also an important resource that birds utilize without having to have open water source. They can use the dew to be able to get their water requirement. And here's, a lot of us like to watch birds, and as such, we have fountains or other kinds of appurtenances, in and around our yards or farmsteads, where we can actually watch the birds as they come in and utilize the water that's available to them there. I know when I start the sprinklers in the summertime, early in the morning, it always attracts a crowd of different kinds of birds that are drinking water off the not only almost directly out of the water source, but as it collects on the leaves and we turn the water off, birds will actually utilize the water that's collected on the plants to drink. So with that, just kind of, again, the more diversity, the more various kinds of plants, the juxtaposition of plants to other plants and to your buildings are all going to be really important components to having, really strong, diverse, healthy bird populations on your farm or on your ranch. So it's kind of a quick thumbnail sketch of birds on your farm and the kinds of cover and space that they need. So with that, if there's a question or two, I'm happy to take them.
Great, thank you, Wendell. So you should all hopefully see a poll that just popped up on your screen as well. That's labeled Wendell Quiz. And again, if maybe you're not seeing those polls, it might just be because you're not using the latest version of Zoom. But if you can see it, if you can go ahead and answer those couple of questions. And in the meantime, Wendell, we did have a question come through about how far will birds actually fly to find water, like on a daily basis. So I know that's going to vary species to species, but if you have any generalizations for us.
That's a great question. And I don't have a great answer for you because like you mentioned, it really is species by species. So there's things like sage grouse will travel up to a mile or 2 miles a day. Things like hummingbirds, they're not going to go very far. So it's really going to, hawks don't generally use a lot of free water, but they can fly great distances if they need to secure their water demands.
Great, thank you. And so Charlotte did ask a follow-up on that. So is there idea of, can you distribute those water sources like in a field by like per acre basis, or is there any other recommendations you could make for farm or ranch?
Another great question. Yeah, it really has to do with the kind of geography that you're in. If you're the further north you are, the wetter you are in the country, whether it's east of the Huntington Meridian or in the northern tier where you've got summer rains and that sort of thing, you probably don't need nearly the intensity and number of water availability on a farm. However, in the west, you get out west of the Huntington Meridian and moving south into our desert states or more drier states, the more water you have, the greater biodiversity you have. And it really goes to something called carrying capacity. So the more water resources you have, I just mentioned a few, maybe they're livestock water troughs, hopefully with an escape ramp. If it's an irrigation ditch, if it's a drainage ditch, if it's a pond, there's all kinds of ways that birds will utilize those water resources. So it really kind of depends on what kind of farm you have and where you're located and the kind of birds that can and do utilize those areas. Kind of a site-by-site kind of specific thing. So when I would make a recommendation, it would really need to go out and look at the farm or on the ranch and see where there are deficiencies in availability of water and where there seems to be an abundance.
Wonderful. And I had a thought, and Thomas asked it in the chat, and you kind of briefly mentioned it, but can you talk a little bit about the dangers of like specifically livestock water troughs and how they could pose issues for animals that maybe get caught in them? If you could just kind of speak a little bit more about what you meant by an escape ramp.
Yeah, probably the best thing I can recommend is livestock water for bats that the Bat Conservation International put out. They've got a really excellent ramp, escape ramp. We found, in the Southwest that some kind of, well, for lack of a better term, flim-flam man came through and talked a lot of the ranchers into having this device over their water structures. And since bats and swallows and other birds are swoop drinkers, they have to have an area that they can come in from, drink, and come out of. And they had these appurtenances that were over the pond, over the water facility, and the animals would hit it, fall in, and not have a way to get out. So the main thing is that it has to be, the escape ramp has to be touching both sides, so when the animals swim around, that they encounter something and they don't swim under it. So putting a stick or a board in doesn't count as a ramp. Those are not safe, and people are fooling themselves if they think those are useful. The second part, besides having an escape ramp, is to make sure that you minimize fences dividing a water trough or other kinds of appurtenances, because when those animals come in to drink, the more opportunity there is to hit something and fall in the water, the more opportunity there is to drown. So going back to the guy in New Mexico selling these products, we found up to 40 bat bodies, in one trough. So these things can really be death traps, literally and figuratively. And that's a whole nother presentation that I have available, that I've got slides that, even have dead elk, hawks, all kinds of animals in these big troughs that get in, they can't get out. So having the water facility is really important out there, but having the proper facility, the safe facility, is really essential.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you, Wendell, for clarifying that. So if you want to go ahead and stop the sharing your screen, it looks like most folks were able to answer these quiz questions correctly. So I don't think we necessarily need to go over them, right? The idea is that almost all of these different aspects provide both cover and water for birds. And so if you had anything to add to that, Wendell, great. If not, I think, Ashley, it's time for you.
Good, thank you.
All righty. Can you hear and see this okay?
Looks great. Thank you, Ashley.
Okay, cool. I'm excited to share with you some of the things I learned when I was in grad school at the University of Delaware. I got to do a really interesting project when I was in the lab of Doug Tallamy. And I think there's some resources from him on the website for this course. So if you want to learn more, check this out for sure. So I'm going to start by sharing some headlines from the past few years. This one made a big splash because this was the New York Times in November 2018, and it was the first time I saw the term insect apocalypse in print, and it was describing a report that came out. It was a meta-analysis of 73 independent reports of insect declines all over the world. So different researchers in different countries had noticed this really alarming trend of insects declining. And it's something that you don't actually have to read the scientific literature to have noticed that it was happening. This headline from Wired from 2020 refers to a car splatometer study. So if you can remember driving down a road in the summertime, like say 20 or 30 years ago, you probably had to clean your windshield at the end of that trip because there'd be so many dead bugs spattered across it. And I very rarely have to do this anymore. So while that's good news for my car, it's bad news for pretty much everything else, because insects are so critical to the ecosystem. Here's one more headline from The Guardian. And it tries to get into, why are the insects declining? It says insect populations are suffering death by 1,000 cuts. So it's not really any one thing. It's a whole vortex of different stressors on their population. So everything from light pollution to pesticide use to development, habitat loss, and so forth. And then lastly, this headline is from The Onion. So if you don't know, The Onion is a satirical source. So this is meant to be a joke. But it says ecologists urge birds to avert global decline of insects by adopting seed-based diet. And I think the reason that the humor works is because there is this undercurrent of truth to it. And the truth is that so many birds do rely on insects in their diet. And we know that more than 1 in 3 North American bird species are declining, just as insect populations are declining. So that's alarming. That's really worrisome. And looking at what they eat, like what they need to survive, we know that 96% of North American terrestrial birds, so land-dwelling birds, rear their young on insects. So this is really interesting because even the species that you might think of as eating seeds or eating fruits, for most of their lifespan, there is this one critical time of their life when they're first growing and developing, when they really need the extra fats and proteins that an insect diet can provide to them. So for my project when I was in grad school, I wanted to figure out which insects are the most important to birds, especially during the breeding season. What are parent birds provisioning their nestlings with? Because if we knew that, it would help us maintain better bird habitat. And the reason for that is, not all insects are equal in their needs and what they their nutritional and their habitat needs. And so many insects, in fact, most insects are host specialists, which means they have a particular plant that they need to survive. They can't eat just anything. And kind of the most famous example of this is the monarch butterfly that depends on milkweed. But that's not the exception, that really is the rule. So most insects are herbivorous, and about 90% of those insect herbivores are specialists, or closer to the specialization end of the spectrum, where it might not be as restrictive as just one plant species, but it might be one plant family, for example. So we say they depend on a particular plant lineage for their survival and their reproduction. So if we could identify which insects are the most important to birds, we can look one step down the food chain and see which host plants are supporting the most insects. So what are the keystone plants, the most important plants that will provide habitat and nutrition for a variety of insects. So this was a really fun project because I got to interact with so many people from around the whole country, and in fact, all of North America, really, because we launched this project that we called What Do Birds Eat? And it was to crowdsource images of birds with arthropods, so insects and then other bugs like spiders in their bills. And so I got to just kind of watch these photos roll in, and my job was to identify the insects from the photos as far down as I could. Sometimes I could only tell what order they're in. So I could tell, for example, like, oh, well, this one's a beetle and this one's a caterpillar. Sometimes the photo was crisp and clear enough that I could identify it to species, especially if it was, from my part of the country with insects that I'm more familiar with. But that at the end of 3 years, we had more than 7,000 photos that came in showing more than 300 North American bird species. And they came from all 50 states, and then most states of Mexico, most provinces of Canada as well. So it's just really cool to see these photos come in. I'm not much of a photographer myself, so I really admire the skills of the photographers who contributed to this. And just on a snapshot, what I learned was that Lepidoptera, that's the order of insects that includes moths and butterflies. It was the largest arthropod prey group for the majority of the families of birds that I looked at. So in 15 of 20 bird families, Lepidoptera was the #1 prey source during the breeding season. And 36% of all the submitted photos showed some kind of Lepidopteran prey. And 85% of those prey were in the larval stage. So rather than an adult moth or an adult butterfly, it was a juvenile, which of course is what we call a caterpillar. So here's a picture, for example, of a downy woodpecker with a carpenter miller caterpillar from Ontario. And I'm going to go through one bird family at a time and just show you just a simple pie chart that will show you what the birds were eating. And then I'll have a couple example photos just to show off some of my favorites. So I'm going to go through this quickly, so I won't expect you to absorb everything, but what I want you to pay attention to is the bright green colored slice of the pie. That's going to show you how many, or the percentage of the diet that was Lepidoptera, so moths, butterflies, and caterpillars. And so this is for the family Mimidae, which is the mockingbirds and closely related birds like catbirds. So based on 133 photos I had for this group, about 29% were Lepidoptera. So here's an example of a gray catbird in Pennsylvania with a caterpillar. And here's a northern mockingbird with a variegated fritillary caterpillar in Texas, and a long-billed thrasher with a caterpillar also in Texas. Moving on to the wrens, we had a lot of photos from this group, and Lepidoptera made up more than 1/3 of the diet during the breeding season, so 35%. So I have a few examples here. Here's a house wren in Ohio, a house wren in West Virginia with an adult moth this time. And then just to mix it up, here's a wren with a katydid. So an example of some of the other insects that did show up. The cardinals and tanagers also had Lepidoptera making up 35% of their diet. So here's a northern cardinal with a hawk moth caterpillar in Texas. And this one, I feel like this summer tanager like really hit the jackpot. It's got like the equivalent of a Thanksgiving turkey with a Luna moth caterpillar in Virginia. For something different, here's a scarlet tanager with a bald-faced hornet in Illinois. And moving on to the next family, which is the blackbirds and orioles. Again, we're seeing Lepidoptera made up 35% of the diet, so more than 1/3 of the arthropod prey during the breeding season. Here's an eastern meadowlark with a Tursa sphinx moth caterpillar in Florida, a Baltimore oriole with a dagger moth caterpillar in Ohio, and a common grackle with a whole bill full of fall cankerworm caterpillars in Virginia. Now we had a lot of photos of thrushes that came in, and you can see for this group, caterpillars are even more important. So Lepidoptera made up 44% of the diet. It's a mountain bluebird in Colorado, and a wood thrush in Pennsylvania, an American robin with a whole lot of things in its bill, including like an earthworm and a cicada, but you can see there's a caterpillar is kind of the first thing sticking out at the tip of the bill there. For warblers, probably one of the most popular groups with bird photographers, just because they come in so many stunning colors and patterns. We had more than 1,000 photos of warblers that were contributed. And in this group, Lepidoptera made up more than half of the diet. So I have a few examples of that. A black and white warbler in Maine, a Kirtland's warbler in Michigan, prothonotary warbler in Virginia. And then for vireos, we're seeing that number creep up even higher. So Lepidoptera made up 62% of the diet in this group. So I have a few more photos to show you. Here's Cassin's vireo with a caterpillar, a blue-headed vireo with a southern tussock moth caterpillar, a red-eyed vireo. Just to mix it up, this one has a spotted cucumber beetle, so something different. And then for the New World sparrows, Lepidoptera made up 65% of the diet, so it really dwarfed the other groups. And I've been ignoring these other groups, but I do have little pictures to kind of give you a clue what they are if you aren't familiar with those order names. So Orthoptera is like the crickets and grasshoppers and katydids. Diptera refers to flies, like the true flies. Hemiptera is the true bugs, so things like stink bugs, but also aphids and cicadas. And then Hymenoptera is ants, bees, and wasps. But really, you can see that it's this green slice of the pie, the Lepidoptera, that is so important to so many bird groups. So here's a dark-eyed junco with several different caterpillars in its bill, a spotted towhee, the hornworm caterpillar in New Mexico, and a chipping sparrow has a cranefly and several caterpillars all in one billful. And then the chickadees and titmice I saved for last because in this group, Lepidoptera made up more than 3/4 of the diet during the breeding season, which is just really incredible to think about. And there's past literature that shows that a single pair of chickadees, if they're going to rear one clutch of nestlings, so just one brood, if they're going to get them from the point where the eggs have hatched until the chicks have fledged and are able to fend for themselves, it takes between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars to make that happen. So these parent chickadees are really working hard to find all that caterpillar protein to feed their nestlings. So here's a Carolina chickadee with a caterpillar in Virginia, a tufted titmouse with a caterpillar also in Virginia. I love that interaction there. The parent looks like it's been working hard. And then something different. Here's a bridled titmouse with a cicada in Arizona. And so I was seeing all these pictures of caterpillars come in, and it kind of raised the question, well, why caterpillars? What's so unique about caterpillars that makes them the ideal bird food? And there's a number of things that could contribute to their importance. So they're low in chitin and high in fat. So chitin is in the insect's exoskeleton, so it's hard and it's not easily digestible. So having low chitin content and a high fat content makes them easy to eat. They're also high in protein, and they're high in micronutrients like calcium, potassium, vitamins. And then they're also rich in something called carotenoids. And carotenoids are important for all vertebrates because we use them for a variety of things. We need them for our reproductive health. We need them for immune health and for good eyesight. If you ever were told when you were a kid you have to eat your carrots so that you would have good eyesight, there is some truth to that because beta carotene, which is found in carrots, it is a precursor to vitamin A, which we need for our vision. And so this chart that I put together, this graph that I put together shows sort of the correlation between carotenoid content, so how rich a given insect group was in carotenoids versus how popular it seemed to be with the birds. So, and this was looking just at bluebirds because in addition to the project that I showed you photos from where I had crowdsourced photos of all different kinds of birds, I also did kind of a deep dive just into eastern bluebirds where I put up camera traps recording what the bluebirds were bringing back to their nestlings. So I had about 8,000 photos from that project. And I found that like I was seeing with other bird species, caterpillars were the most dominant prey item, and they were also the highest in carotenoid content. And then you can see other groups that were heavily preyed on, like Orthoptera, the crickets and grasshoppers. They're also pretty rich in carotenoids. And then the groups that are fed on much less, like millipedes, for example, they tend to be very low in carotenoid content, and the earwigs, and so on and so forth. So there does seem to be, maybe this is part of the answer. Birds have another reason that they need carotenoids, which is that carotenoids give them the brilliant reds and yellows and oranges that many of them have in their plumage. And that can be really important in helping them to signal their health and their potential as a mate. And so that can help them to find a mate. It's considered an honest indicator of their health, because a bird that appears really bright and healthy probably is, because if they're getting lots of carotenoids in their diet, they're probably healthier than a duller counterpart of the same species. So overwhelmingly, I saw that caterpillars are the most important arthropod prey to birds. And then we already knew from past research that they're extremely host specific. So again, about 90% of insect herbivores have a particular plant lineage they depend on. And so what that really means is that they need native plants to survive, because as our landscapes become invaded with plants that came from the other side of the world, our insects overwhelmingly, they can't just suddenly adapt or shift their diet to start eating this new plant. And some of them can do that, but most of them are just going to disappear if their host plant disappears too. So I wanted to direct your attention to this really helpful web tool. It's by the National Wildlife Federation, and it's called the Native Plant Finder. It's very user-friendly. You just plug in your zip code and it will populate for you a list of plants that support a lot of insects. And there's a little butterfly icon that will tell you specifically, how many caterpillar species are supported by that plant. And I first did this using my Delaware zip code. And so it's divided into flowers and grasses. You can see it recommended a goldenrod to me. And then it also gives you a separate list of trees and shrubs with the genus Quercus, which is the oaks. That was by far the most important keystone plant that supports the most insect life. And then just for fun, because I know we have people from all over, I put in a California zip code just to see how much this would change. So you can see there, it did populate a slightly different list. Goldenrod still made the top 10, but it's not as important as some of these other plant genera that came up. And then oaks were number 2. And willows were number 1. So it does kind of depend where you are. And this list was heavily influenced by, it really got a jump start with the work done by my advisor, Doug Tallamy. So it does sort of have an East Coast bias, but it is being constantly updated all the time. So we are learning more and more about plant insect associations all over the country. So my goal in sharing this is that we can take these kind of these landscapes that are very heavily manicured, which, it does look very neat and tidy. I think at one point in my life, I would have thought that this was a pretty yard. But right now I'm seeing it, as your course title suggests, is trying to see it through the eyes of birds. And now to me, this looks like a food desert. I mean, can you imagine being a parent chickadee and you've got a clutch of chicks in one of those trees, and you've got to find between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars if you don't want your babies to starve to death? And it's not going to happen in a landscape that looks like this. But it could happen in a landscape that looks more like this one, which really is also very, very attractive. I think it's much more interesting for sure. And then, we can apply that same kind of thinking to corporate landscapes. This one is not very interesting and certainly not very biodiverse. But then here's another landscape. This is a corporate landscape in Delaware where they, took what used to be pretty much an unused lawn and turned it into this wildlife habitat. And I imagine, and I'm starting to get kind of out of my wheelhouse, but if I were a worker at this company, I would prefer taking my lunch breaks in a landscape that looks like this one rather than that last one I showed you. And here's just one example of how I used the Native Plant Finder and kind of applied it to my own yard. So I've got an image here of an eastern bluebird eating a spicebush swallowtail caterpillar, which I think is one of the cutest caterpillars around. I also have a picture that my advisor took of a white-eyed vireo feeding one to its nestlings. And I knew from using the Native Plant Finder that this was, in a recommended plant genus for me. And I have an image here that shows, like, if you're in the green part of this map, then spicebush is a native plant for this area. So I decided to plant some spicebush in my yard. And I was so excited when I found this spicebush plant that had been obviously munched on by some insects. So it is kind of like a paradigm shift. I know people often, for decades, we were used to not being happy about seeing evidence of insect herbivory on our plants. And you would think it's time to grab a can of spray and kill them all so we can protect the plant, and learning to accept that this is normal. Insects have been eating plants for millions of years. They've been co-evolving for millions of years. It's very rare for a plant to actually, if the plant is otherwise healthy, it's not stressed from disease or drought, a little bit of insect herbivory is not going to kill it. They can really bounce back from being defoliated, and they refoliate, and that's a part of a normal cycle that's been happening throughout plant and insect evolution. So again, if we want to save the birds, we got to think in terms of the whole food web, and I strongly recommend planting native. If we want to conserve birds, we need to be planting a wide variety of native plants. And as Doug Tallamy likes to say, we should garden as if life depended on it, because it does. And got a acknowledgement slide here for all the people who helped me when I was in grad school. With most importantly, note at the bottom, 1,200 plus community scientists who contributed photos of birds, which I'm so happy I got to share some of those with you. And thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll take any questions if we have time for it.
Amazing. Wow. Like, the amount of information and the diversity of caterpillars and birds is just so clear from that presentation. So thank you so much, Ashley. So folks, you should see another poll that appeared on your screen that's just asking a couple questions about what Ashley presented on today. And I didn't see any questions pop up yet for you, Ashley, but I did want to just ask real quick, for your area and all that information that you were kind of collecting data on with those eastern bluebirds, were there certain plant genera rock stars that just for you, if you could give folks a recommendation for, say, one tree, one shrub, and one like herbaceous plant, were there any rock star plants that just seem to support so many different insects?
Yes, well, oaks, by and large, that genus is super important, and especially if you can plant a white oak, that will support a lot of insect life. Willows are also extremely important, so shout out to them. And then when it comes to shrubs, I recommend goldenrod as a real rock star or keystone plant. And I will mention, a lot of people erroneously will blame goldenrod for their allergies. You know, when they see the goldenrod blooming, and then it's around the same time that they're getting seasonal allergies. But goldenrod is actually, it's insect pollinated. It's not wind pollinated. So its pollen is not flying through the air, making you feel bad. It's you're blaming goldenrod for what's actually ragweed or something else. So at least I know I hear people complaining about it all the time, but it's one of those mistaken identities. So a strong plug for goldenrod. Oh, and I see there's a question about which species of oak trees are the best. Really, they're all fantastic. White oaks in particular.
Right. Yeah, and of course, right, it's all regional specific as far as.
And that's why I really like that website, where it's tailored to your exactly where you are, if you put in your zip code.
Yeah, and so I think, because now we'll kind of transition into this moment where we can kind of field some questions and talk about examples with both of our speakers today. But actually we did, the poll was concluded. And so of course, I think folks had learned that the oak tree, right, is just one of the phenomenal genera that supports the most insect life in North America. And then not unsurprisingly, everybody got the Lepidoptera as the insect
Awesome.
order with the most insect, bird food. So well done, everybody. So Wendell and Ashley, I want to ask another question for you, Ashley, because somebody asked about the summer feeding of birds, right? So you were talking a lot about these caterpillars, insect foods, especially for birds when they're trying to feed their babies. But did you have any information about how those birds may be consuming other different types of foods? And Thomas here is asking about high protein foods like suet and bird feeders. So did you have any information on that?
I think supplementing birds' natural diet with, whether it's bird seed or suet, or sometimes people will put out, dried mealworms is another popular choice. As far as I know, that helps to support them through lean times. There's always the possibility that, one year, maybe because of, changing climate or different weather phenomena, maybe there's like an asynchrony or like a timing mismatch where a migratory bird species isn't here at the time when the insect populations are at their peak. And so they might have a year when it's just harder for them to find the protein they need. As far as I know, I mean, I'm someone who does put out bird feeders in suet. I know you do have to kind of be cautious about, sometimes there'll be a local advisory to not do that because you don't want to aggregate birds in times when a particular pathogen, disease is circulating in the area that they might spread. I think people understand that better now in terms of, COVID terms. We've all learned about the importance of social distancing, and so that can apply to birds too. But in the absence of any kind of phenomenon like that, I think supplemental food can be important and can be helpful to them for sure. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, and Wendell, did you have any thoughts not only about that feeding, but also just the seasonality as well? Can you just elaborate a little bit more about how these different plants could provide food resources or cover at different times of the year?
Yeah, I think Ashley covered it pretty well. It's, the big thing to pay attention to, and a lot of people don't, is the maintenance of these things that are intended to help birds. So in other words, you got to change that water every day. You got to change the food. You can't let it mold. You can't let it get old or spoil because you end up killing it. The one thing that I would really strongly recommend is stop using red dye in your hummingbird feeders. That is causes fungus and mortality in hummingbirds. Just pure white sugar in water is what you need. Leave the red dye on the shelf. Don't use that. But the other thing too is your soot feeders can mold and melt, as temperatures elevate, and so just keeping these things and not to mention nest boxes. If you put out nest boxes, clean them out. Don't let the birds use them year after year. So that would be the number one thing that I would recommend people. If you're going to attract birds, if you're going to use these different appurtenances to augment their habitat, make sure that they're maintained. Make sure that they're cleaned.
Great. And actually a question came up earlier for you, Wendell, and it is related to this concept of if we're providing resources for these birds, we want them to be safe resources, right? And so this question was asking about the use of irrigation ditches for bird water sources. Is there a risk of chemical either running off into those ditches or those ditches themselves being used for chemical applications?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's seen the scorched earth irrigation ditches, that they come in and spray them every year so that there's nothing growing on them. John Anderson recently passed, was one of the pioneers of making sure that in Yolo County, California, that the ditches got vegetation, and a lot of times if the vegetation is in there, that there's actually a natural filtering of some of those chemical compounds that are problematic. It's really a tough question because I mentioned drainage ditches just because they are used, not because they're the safest and best use, because they do transport chemicals out off the farm. Hopefully, the local ag commissioners are doing a good job of making sure that the applications are prudent and according to label, and that there's not a lot of runoff. But I'm not Pollyanna. I don't believe that's the case all the time. So it's one of those two-edged swords where when you do have drainage ditches, animals will use them, and they probably do have compounds in them that are not necessarily for animal health.
Wonderful. Well, now we're kind of at that time where we want to try and wrap up today's lesson. So you should have now the survey number 2 poll. So this is poll is just going to be important for us because it helps not only us understand the information that we're providing to you and if it's connecting, but also so that we can provide that information to our funders so that hopefully we can continue to provide these sorts of trainings for everyone. So while you're filling out that poll, Wendell or Ashley, did you have any kind of final takeaways that you wanted to leave with our participants today that maybe just didn't have a chance to say it earlier?
I thought of one thing, and I'm actually borrowing this from someone else. So this idea is from someone named Tammany Baumgarten, but they came up with the concept of the 10-step program for evaluating insect damage on your plants. And it's not literally 10 steps. It's, if you see an insect is eating your plant, take 10 steps away from the plant. And does the tree or does the plant look healthy from that vantage point? And if it does, you don't need to do anything. It's part of the normal ecological interaction, the plant supporting the insect, and the insect is going to go on to support a bird or some other wildlife. So, don't reach for that can of spray just yet.
Wonderful. Yeah, perspective kind of idea. I love it. And how about you, Wendell?
Yeah, I'd say that one of the things that I think is most important, and farmers and ranchers do this on a daily basis, but maybe through putting on a different lens, is really start paying attention at times of year, like during rainstorms or during a blizzard, or when it's particularly hot. If you're brave enough to get out there and actually walk around and see what's going on, what are birds using, where are they, what kind of activities are they engaged in, not just birds, but all the wildlife that share your farm with you. You are a steward, and it's your responsibility, like it or not, to share your land in positive ways with these wildlife. And if you have the opportunity, like during a rainstorm, you see a lot of mud coming off the field, into your water courses, and this includes fish too. Fish probably, it's like looking at the China Olympics, a few years back when you could barely see anything. It's the same thing with fish in the sediment in the water. It's like it's not a good thing for them, and you're probably going to get a lot of mortality. So where's the source of that muddy water coming into your water courses? What's the source of maybe some you see some fish kills, or you see some algae blooms or other kinds of things where other animals are trying to use those resources on your farm. Maybe it's your neighbor that's contributing upstream. So there's having conversations with your neighbors. The point was made, are you going to share this with your neighbors? And hopefully you will, because all of you, every farmer and rancher out there, you're leaders. People look at you, they see what you're doing, they look over the fence, they talk to you, they look at your farm. As Leopold once said, a farmer paints his portrait on the land, and you can tell a lot about a farmer by looking at what his farm or what his ranch looks like.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I think you did such an amazing job of trying to extend those considerations that we humans provide for ourselves and those families around us. We want to provide them with nutritious food, safe places to live and grow and become resilient humans. And when we extend that out to our bird friends, right, it's just the same. We want them to be in these healthy and resilient environments as well. And thank you both for just doing such a good job of connecting those ideas to our bird feathered friends out there in nature. So folks, thank you so much for participating in our 9th webinar. In a couple weeks, we're going to have our final 10th lesson. And indeed, that's going to be where we try and just bring it all together. How do we bring all that information that we've learning for the past few months into some real practical ways that we can prioritize what birds prefer on our farm? So if you have any of these remnant questions or ideas about particular plants and how to connect them with what the birds need, we're going to be providing some information for you on our next lesson. And with that, I want to thank both of you, Wendell and Ashley, so much. Thank you all for joining us today, and I hope you keep it wild on your farms. and we'll see you in a couple weeks. Thank you.